Hello students, welcome to another lecture. So we are going to cover chapter 7 today. You'll see there's a little bit different format than maybe some of the previous videos. Let's test this out today and see if this is better. So far I've liked it better. Let's see if we like a whole lecture like this. Alright, so chapter 7 covers physical and cognitive development of middle childhood. So if you remember from one of our first lectures, middle childhood starts at about age 6 and ends anywhere between 11 and 13. It depends who you ask. Some people say adolescence starts at about age 12, but some say it's 13. So middle and late childhood extend through about 6 to 11 to 13. So we'll be talking about physical changes, cognitive changes, and some continued language development throughout this time. So let's jump into it. So with that, the physical development during this time is slower but consistent. So we had some really quick growth at the beginning of the lifespan, and then it's slower at this point, but it is consistent. And then in adolescence, it'll jump a little bit again. So about 2 to 3 inches a year in height and 5 to 7 pounds a year in weight. So most of that weight gain actually comes from skeletal growth, muscle growth and organ growth, rather than fat. So the body itself just getting bigger rather than putting on any fat. So bone ossification is also happening, which is essentially taking the bones and adding more bone cells. It's becoming stiffer, the bones are becoming more dense, a little harder, also tend to become more brittle as we age as well, but they're still quite amenable to more flex than they would be if you were, say, 50 years old. So brain development is also happening during this time. So like we've talked about before, at this age, your brain is about 90% of its adult weight. So what that means is the sections of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, the occipital lobe, all those things have been in place many years by this time. And a lot of myelination has already happened. A lot of pruning has already happened of unnecessary dendrites and axon branches. With that being said, all the time you're adding new axon branches, new dendrites, and pruning them as well. So the main process right now is still some myelination happening. So dendrites can still be formed and still be pruned all the time throughout the lifespan, not just early and not late, all throughout the lifespan that's happening. So the brain is specializing. There's a lot more activation in the prefrontal cortex at this time in childhood than there has been previously. As for motor development, both gross and fine motor skills are a lot smoother. So children at the age of 11 are capable of most sports, so tennis, climbing, soccer, gymnastics, whereas before this, they weren't capable of maybe that smooth of movements. So boys usually do outperform girls in gross motor skills at these ages, and girls usually do outperform boys in more fine motor skills. So with that, the fine motor skill improvement likely comes mostly from the myelination of those axons in the brain. So it lets messages to hands be delivered more quickly and more accurately than beforehand. Handwriting ability also improves. Unless you're me, then your handwriting ability just declines ever since you stopped working on it in like 3rd grade. So honestly, I'm surprised anybody can, even I can read my writing anymore. So, but mostly I type, so it doesn't really matter that much. So as for exercise, in middle and late childhood, on average, most children are not getting enough exercise. So there should be about 55 minutes or more of moderate to vigorous physical activity per day for children in these age ranges. And there's also a lot of cognitive benefits to exercise. I mean, not just for middle and late children, that extends all throughout life. And we'll talk about this at many points in the lifespan. So improved attention, executive function, children who are exercising more have more academic achievement, better job in inhibiting different drives and impulses, and they also have better working memory. And we'll talk about working memory in a lot more detail today. Parents can model exercise for children, so if children are seeing their parents exercise, they will be more likely to do so. So I've been a lot better at exercising recently, pretty regularly, and with that, it's been kind of funny to see how my children, who one is in middle childhood, one is in early childhood, how they will pretend to exercise. So the other day, my younger child made some Legos look like a dumbbell, and he was lifting it up with both of his hands. It's like a few ounce Lego, and he's working out with it. It was really cute. And then my daughter, who's in middle childhood, she was talking about one of her friend's parents and mentioned specifically they're pretty fun. They don't exercise as much as you, or they don't work out as much as you, or something like that. And one, it made me feel really good. And two, I was like, oh, good. I'm being an effective model of this kind of healthy behavior. So she often asks to work out with us, which is also good, except it's after her bedtime. She's probably trying to push her bedtime off, and she's pretty active during the day. She likes to play and run around and do sports and that kind of thing. So I don't think she needs the workout at this time. Honestly, I think both of us need her bedtime to stay right where it is. So PE in school is very successful at helping to improve fitness and lowering fat of children in middle and late childhood. So what do you think middle and late childhood children, it's a lot of children all in one sentence, so children of this age, what are they doing instead of being active? So maybe just pause the video really quick and list like the 3 things you think they are doing instead of being active throughout the day. All right, so one of those things you probably said was watching screens. So that is one of the most common things that children in middle and late childhood are doing instead of being more active, is using screens. Video games, just passively watching videos, all sorts of things like that. And this is one reason that we see more obesity and more overweight children at this time in history. So children in the US and China on average have been overweight at increasing rates. So heredity is an important risk or preventative factor. So if as a child a parent was overweight, that genetic heredity is going to be a risk factor for that. A parent who was very skinny in childhood, that could be a preventative factor for their child later on to not be overweight. So environmental effects also matter. So having regular meal times throughout the day, that helps a lot, rather than just letting children snack whenever they want. Sometimes that can be hard as well. Having set amounts of screen time, that can help also, so that children are not just on their screens for hours and hours and hours, maybe an hour or half hour chunk here, hour or half hour chunk there. Some of my friends have been watching Avatar: The Last Airbender with their children at a certain time of day. I think that is a really great habit to get in for everybody. We should just watch Avatar: The Last Airbender just all throughout our lives. Can learn a lot from Uncle Iroh. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, honestly, just pause the video, go watch Avatar, and then come back and watch the rest of the lecture. You might not be able to binge the entire series in just a couple days where you should be watching this lecture. Maybe watch a few episodes, come back, I would definitely approve of that screen time. So schools offering and emphasizing healthy foods can really help children in middle and late childhood. And then also ensuring that children are getting that 55 or more minutes of physical activity a day. So the consequences of being overweight in children are that children who are overweight in either middle or late childhood are at much higher risks of hypertension, which is high blood pressure, higher blood cholesterol, and obesity in adolescence and then adulthood, which have also their own health risks later on. So let's watch a little video that talks about overweight children in a little more detail. And hopefully you'll be able to hear the audio for this better than previous videos with this new setup.
The ultimate answer to the childhood obesity epidemic is to deal with what's been called our toxic environment, with junk food everywhere, advertising unhealthful products to kids, inadequate opportunities for physical activity. But that's going to be a long-term prospect. We can begin to protect our children immediately in one environment through which we have 100% control, and that's the home. Parents can use very basic behavioral change practices to begin to guide their children to a healthy lifestyle right away. And that's in fact the focus of the work that we do in the Optimal Weight for Life, or the OWL program at Children's Hospital Boston. The two key parenting practices really at any age are called protecting the home environment and modeling. Protecting the home environment simply means if it doesn't support health, don't bring it in the home. You can say no once to your kids when they're asking you for that gallon of ice cream in the supermarket, or you can try to say no every night when they're nagging you for it if it's sitting in the freezer. The same also applies to physical activity. Let's not have a high-definition, widescreen television in every room. Let's put opportunities for physical activity, active games, kids can close the doors, have fun, and enjoy themselves.
So, obviously not the point of the video, but I do think it was funny that he specifically mentioned widescreen, high-definition TV. It's like, okay, so should I then put a low-definition TV in all my children's rooms? Obviously not the point, just the way he phrased it. I guess I wanted to be snarky and rude to a video that doesn't even know I'm talking to them. So maybe I should edit this part out of this video.
The second key parenting practice is called modeling. And the idea here is that if you do it, they'll do it. But the opposite is also true. If you don't do it, they won't do it. When parents are eating well and engaging in a physically active lifestyle, they'll be modeling the right behaviors for the overweight or obese child, and the parents' own cardiovascular risk factors improve. All too often, parents resort to negative practices like nagging, punishment, criticism. Very common for parents to try to force their kids to eat foods that they think are healthy, like fruits and vegetables, or excessively restrict other foods like candy. But these practices tend to backfire. They make the kid dislike fruits and vegetables and actually crave those restricted foods even more. Instead, we encourage practices like praise, goal setting, self-monitoring, something we call empowerment, where kids actually participate in food preparation, even food selection. And we have a saying that if they cook it, or if they select it in the store, they'll probably eat it. Many parents are working multiple jobs, leaving little time to shop for and prepare foods at home. Also, especially in some inner city communities, fast food is cheap and available, and nutritious food ingredients like fruits and vegetables can be very expensive or literally unavailable. Yet another factor is that children are under a lot of stress almost ridiculously early in life. Young children are under academic pressures to exceed in scholastic studies, and this can not only limit time for being outdoors, playing, and relaxing, but also put so much stress on a young child that it influences their eating habits. They may turn to food for comfort, and obesity is the almost unavoidable consequence.
So I think there was a really good example there at the end of the multiple contexts affecting one specific kind of behavior, and one behavior maybe affecting multiple contexts. So it talked about, well, when shopping, make sure that you're purchasing good food, maybe getting the kids involved. If the area you live in doesn't have access to food, well, that's a context where it might be harder to have healthy eating habits for a child. Also, if children are more stressed in school, they have a lot of responsibilities placed on them, even higher than they should have, then that can lead them to want to eat more junk food, right, as a coping mechanism. So there's all these other contexts that can affect this one specific developmental behavior. And then that specific behavior can then lead to maybe positive things in the future or negative things in the future. So positive being things like good health in the future, less likely to get illness, lower blood pressure, things like that. And the alternative is all these various contexts can affect eating behavior in middle childhood, can lead to things like higher risk for heart disease later on. So I think it's a really great, easy to understand example of how many contexts affect specific human behavior within development. And so this whole system, this developing human, this middle child, or child in middle childhood, is developing with all these pressures around them, kind of pushing or pulling a specific direction, leading to either protective factors or risk factors for later on down in their life. So really good tie-in to previous things that we've talked about with the bioecological systems theory, learners developmental systems theory. So with that, let's jump back into other things. Some really good points that made was that for young children, especially in this age group, having them pick their own foods is really, really helpful. You might not be able to have them go to the store with you. Maybe you're going to the store while they're in school or something like that. That's what we often do. But we have our daughter give us a list of foods that she wants to eat or things that she's heard of that she wants to try. It was by doing this that pretty recently, actually, just a few weeks ago, she said, I want to eat some peas in a pod. And we had tried to feed that to her before because they're delicious. So, like sweet snap peas in their pods are so good. I want some right now. But she had never eaten them. They're too green, they're too crunchy, whatever reason, she would take a nibble and just not eat any. But she mentioned, hey, I saw this on a show or something, and she wanted to try it. So she wrote it down on her little list. She puts little boxes for us to check it off when we buy it. And so we put that into our list, and then we bought that for her, and then she did eat it, and she did like it. So that was a really good example of letting children choose their foods, and we even let them choose snacks. So do you want popsicles this week, or do you want ice cream this week? Something like that. So letting them choose makes them a lot more excited. If they are interested in cooking, that can be really helpful. So sometimes some children are really interested, some might not be. They might want to assemble or put things on their plate themselves. So any kind of involvement in prepping a meal for themselves will really help with healthy eating habits. You can encourage, okay, so you chose X, Y, and Z, maybe now get another food group. So they don't have any dairy. Hey, do you want some cheese? Do you want some yogurt? Do you want some milk? And then let them pick from those things. So great examples there. So let's jump to a completely different, well, maybe not completely different because we're talking about developmental systems. They are all related to each other. Let's talk about disabilities. So learning disabilities specifically are things that make it difficult to learn in regards to understanding spoken and written language is what we're talking about for learning disabilities at this age, or that's how they're defined, are things that make it harder to understand spoken or written language. So this could be due to problems in the way a child is listening, so even hearing, thinking, reading, writing, or spelling. Any problems in one or more of those areas could display as a learning disability, something that's making it more difficult to understand spoken or written language. This is middle childhood is usually the beginning of elementary school, the first couple grades, that kind of time. So most commonly the problem we see is with reading. So dyslexia is an example that you've probably all heard of. So it's a severe impairment in the ability to read and spell. There's another one that's similar to that. It's dysgraphia, and that's difficulty in handwriting. You're either writing slowly or illegibly. You might have a hard time matching sounds to letters. And then there's dyscalculia, and that's essentially the same as dyslexia, maybe not the same. It's similar to dyslexia, but for math and numbers. So difficulty in math computation, not really understanding that. So likely these are located in multiple parts of the brain. So someone who has dyslexia, it's probably not just like one specific part that's causing that. So because we are integrating information from multiple brain regions to do things like read the words on these slides right now, or read numbers and calculate something, comprehend a story that we're reading. So that uses multiple parts of the brain. So the problem's not usually in just one specific part of the brain. Interventions usually focus on improving the reading ability, and intensive instruction helps. And what that means is essentially like one-on-one, the more intensive it can be, the more helpful. So if you have a child who's getting one-on-one therapy for learning to read better, they will do better than someone who, say, in with that same instructor or therapist or teacher, but they have 5 other students with them. So the more intensive instruction, the more helpful it tends to be. Another one that we'll talk about is ADHD. So that diagnosis includes a consistent showing of inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and again, you would have to look at the is it Diagnostic Service Manual or Diagnostic Statistics Manual? I always forget. DSM. You don't have to have each of these to then be diagnosed with ADHD, but a certain number of them. And then a doctor would say, okay, you have 3 of these 5 criteria, so this is your diagnosis. So these are the options or possibilities: inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. So inattention is a difficulty focusing on one thing. So in a child, you might not notice that they're getting bored. They might only stay on a specific task for a few minutes at a time. Hyperactivity is high levels of physical activity, maybe moving around a lot, seeming constantly in motion, not being able to sit still in a chair, getting up, moving around the room. Those are common things you might see. And impulsivity is difficulty curbing actions or reactions. So less impulse control, more reactive to things. They might not seem like they're thinking before they're acting, which in and of itself is very common in early and middle childhood. So by late childhood, those abilities, a lot of them are coming from the prefrontal cortex. So a lot of those abilities will improve over time. So it can be difficult for an outside observer, for a parent or a teacher, to try and diagnose something as ADHD. So that is why getting it properly diagnosed is important. So with that, 9 times more boys than girls are diagnosed with ADHD. There's disagreement over the reasons for that, and as well as the reasons for increased frequency of diagnosis for ADHD. But whatever the reason, young people who do have ADHD are at higher risk of lower academic achievement, underachievement in math and reading, substance abuse, and antisocial behavior. So it's something that we are definitely concerned with. We want to help young people navigate this and learn proper tools and abilities so that they don't have these kinds of risk factors. We want to provide them with protective factors. So ADHD there might be a genetic tendency that leads to ADHD developing. Also, brain damage pre or postnatal can also lead to a higher risk of ADHD. The prefrontal cortex development, delays with fewer connections or decreased myelination can cause ADHD. And then neurotransmitters dopamine and serotonin may also play a role. And interestingly, a lot of the different medicines for ADHD affect dopamine or serotonin in different ways. That's one reason a lot of times antidepressants are one of the common drugs used for ADHD. But probably the most common that you're used to hearing about are stimulants. So Ritalin and Adderall can be helpful at improving attention ability. There should actually be a question paper example talking more about stimulants as a treatment for ADHD. I go into a little detail there of how I was diagnosed with ADHD in middle childhood, and that my mother was afraid of using Ritalin or Adderall because at that time there was a fear that it would lead to substance abuse later on in the child's life, because essentially it's a lot of the same critical chemicals as things like methamphetamines in these drugs. So that was a fear then. So that question paper example, one, it's good to see another example, how I cite things in a question paper, or how you should be citing things in a question paper, and then learn a little bit more about these stimulants and how they're actually quite a lot safer. Those fears were quite unfounded. Really the only serious risk factor for these stimulants is actually it can impact growth. With at middle childhood can be important if a child is on maybe the smaller sides. It can lead to slower growth, which could be problematic. So behavior management also helps in combination with drugs. So learning things like neurofeedback, which is learning skills of how the brain is processing information. Mindfulness meditation can help as well, and physical exercise, especially aerobic exercise, can help, especially if it's dopamine or serotonin related in an individual's brain. Physical exercise can really help with those neurotransmitters in the brain. So that's one of the things that I still find very helpful now are the behavior management tools that I learned from therapists and then learned through learning cognitive psychology throughout time are still some of the most helpful when I feel my ADHD coming on and having those things like impulse control problems or getting distracted really easily or not being able to focus on a single task. So those behavior management techniques can be really helpful and are great tools to learn throughout life. So another one to talk about is autism spectrum disorders. So these range between the more severe autistic disorders to the more milder Asperger's syndrome. So with that being said, I think it's probably more accurate to say we think of what we think of as autistic is further away from neurotypical versus a lot of times we see people with Asperger's syndrome as closer to neurotypical. They're more they're more what we might expect from a neurotypical person. So both of them, this whole spectrum of autism spectrum disorders tend to be sensitive to sensory information, so more so than neurotypical people. So they have a lower level of executive function as well as their working memory, and it usually is identified in early or middle childhood. There's a lot of work being done to identify the precursors to autism spectrum disorder earlier and earlier. The earlier you're learning new behavioral techniques and ways to manage the way that your brain is working, the better off you'll be able to live in this world that's really built for neurotypical people. So with that, autistic disorder is a severe developmental disorder, leads to abnormalities in communication, often restrictive or repetitive patterns of behavior. It often affects social relationships poorly. It can be hard to make friends or maintain friendships when you're not communicating really well. And if you're not having those opportunities in middle childhood to socialize well, then that's going to be more difficult for you as you're growing up to have those kinds of opportunities and learn those skills that you missed out on maybe in middle childhood. So Asperger's syndrome, relatively good verbal language skills. So it might not. So this is one reason it's seen as a little more similar to someone who's neurotypical. So still have nonverbal language problems, so like picking up on nonverbal cues, for example, repetitive routines as well, and preoccupations with particular subjects. So a client I worked with at one point who was on the spectrum was preoccupied with bugs that lived in colonies, so termites, ants, those kinds of things, and would just really focus on that as an example. So causes, well, might be abnormalities in brain structure or problems with neurotransmitters, a lack of connectivity between different brain areas. Genetic factors might increase risk, but really there's a lot of research still trying to figure out what are the causes of these kind of neurodivergent behaviors that we call disorders. So some treatments are having a really structured classroom, so having patterns and daily have the same kinds of things. Individualized teaching helps a lot. Honestly, individualized teaching would help any young person really well to be able to teach specific subjects individually, so they're getting the proper scaffolding they need, but it can be especially helpful for people with these different disabilities. Small group instruction, and again, behavior modification techniques. So the earlier we find people who are a little bit neurodivergent on the autism spectrum, ADHD, dyslexia, those kinds of things, teaching them ways to manage those things, behavior modify, so that they can still succeed and achieve within this really neurotypical world that is structured around them, that will be the best thing to do and very effective. So one thing that You might have heard of before is an IEP, an individualized education plan. So it's basically a written statement or contract between medical professionals, the doctors working with this young person, the teachers, maybe the school district, the school administration, about how to modify that young person's education. So when I was working with young people, I often sat in on these IEP planning meetings, and so one or two teachers might be there, and we would talk about, well, these are the needs of this young person. How can we help you adjust your class or prep them for your class so that they do well on, say, the standardized tests that are coming up? Or what can we do to change your classroom to be a little more structured and not too different than what you're usually doing to modify it and support their learning a little better? Those kinds of things. Also, sometimes like discipline contracts, like these are the things you do when they do this behavior, this behavior, this behavior, so on and so forth. So, did just mention that. So another thing is having the least restrictive environment available. So attempting to include neurodivergent students as much as possible into regular classes is very, very helpful. So they feel less like they are being put off in a corner. These young people feel less like they're being put off in a corner and kind of abandoned or doing their own thing. If they can be with their peers, they are getting that social interaction. They might still be working on other social skills that the other kids might have mastered, but that's okay. They feel more included, and that has a lot of benefit for them. So there's a couple relevant videos here. We're only going to watch one of these right now, but I definitely do recommend watching all of these. We might include some of them in our discussion board this week, but I'm pretty sure this is the one I wanted to watch. We're not going to watch all of it. We're just going to get a little more discussion on what is neurodiversity, what does that mean, how is that different than looking at these as learning disabilities.
My name is Elisabeth Wiklander, and I am autistic. What do you think about when you hear the word autistic? How do you react when you hear the word autism? Would you say that it is a lifelong disorder, an impairment, a disability? This is indeed the way medical language describes it, but autism is so much more than that. No diagnostic manual can truly explain the multifaceted experience of autism. It is a neurological difference with a vast spectrum of representation within its population. It can come with remarkable gifts and skills, as well as devastating traits. But autism doesn't necessarily equal disability. And thankfully, today we have a word that challenges this negative terminology: neurodiversity. Neurodiversity describes how diverse we are as human beings from a neurological perspective. It suggests that the many variations of human brains, like autistic ones, should be accepted as a natural and valuable part of humanity's genetic legacy. DNA shows us that autism is primarily a genetic condition, something that has been passed down through generations and is still widely shared in the general population. These genes can carry something so positive, in spite of the difference they cause, that they have persisted throughout our evolution and still flourish today. Some of our important inventions, pieces of art and music, and discoveries in scientific fields that have moved our world forwards come from autistic minds. With today's exciting new technologies in neuroscience, we have seen that autistic brains differ from the norm. Not only that, but it appears, as if each and every one differs in its own unique way. So, autism is rich in expression, but still faces limiting generalizations. Today, I want to talk about the autism that I display, the one that blends with normality and can have catastrophic impacts on people's lives, not necessarily because of the autism itself, but because of the ignorance of it, or the failure to recognize that it is there in the first place, as I eventually would discover. Now, in social situations, we do have expectations upon one another. We use a certain kind of rule book, which, when followed, rewards us with social acceptance. But I always felt that I was different. The trouble was I couldn't explain how, and certainly not why. It felt as if I had been provided a different rule book, and that I lacked a community to fall back upon that could confirm to me that the way I interpreted the world was valid too. So I grew up feeling very misunderstood by pretty much everybody, even within my own family. If I applied what would have been my motives, my intentions upon someone else's behavior, or vice versa, the outcome was often negative and very confusing. So to me, the social world became scary and unpredictable. Now, I did notice, however, especially during my school years here in Sweden, that my mind had been blessed with gifts, like analytical skills, an intense mental focus, high capacity for memorizing information, which made studying very pleasurable and easy. So in my academic pursuit, I came here to Gothenburg, where I studied at the university. I later went to the Netherlands, where I attained my Master of Music. And today, I live in the UK, working as a professional cellist in the London Philharmonic Orchestra, touring the world. But this, however, is quite unusual for me, to stand on a stage just talking to you without my instrument. I can't help the feeling that I have forgotten it somewhere. Okay, so one may now think, okay, she plays in this great orchestra. She's obviously done pretty well for herself. What's the problem? Well, I have a very literal mind. And it constantly clashes with both non-verbal and verbal subtleties in social situations. It gives me a very direct line of approach and speech in everyday conversations. I still don't really understand the purpose of small talk, although I can appreciate it now. And jokes and sarcasm fly completely over my head. My mind just takes things in so literally. It loves to analyze everything. My world is a very intense one. My senses are heightened. My brain absorbs everything in through an amplifier. My special interests can completely consume me. And my emotions, they go from the highest of high to the lowest of low, and they're on and off like a light switch. My family, bless them, they can still stand in utter disbelief when I go from a complete nuclear blast to rainbows and butterflies in less than 2 seconds, literally. So, okay, autism influences my thoughts, my imagination, my senses, my emotions, and the way I process information. But without knowing this, it was very difficult to maintain friendships, because our social expectations were so different. I could come across as odd, and I experienced a good amount of bullying for it. But the most devastating were the eroding misunderstandings that dominated the relationships with the people closest to me. Body signals, misread. Words, completely misinterpreted. It was so frustrating. It was like fighting a ghost, something that no one could really grasp, not even the counselors we sought for help. So it was a mentally agonizing situation, that persisted year after year.
So, great examples, I think, in that TED Talk. It goes on to talk about different ways that people can support, but I think the main point that I want to get across with that discussion of neurodiversity is the point that people with these things that we've been calling disorders, so autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, and we call them disabilities or disorders, things like dyslexia, all of these things fall under this umbrella term of neurodivergent. So people who have ADHD, their brain is literally working a slightly different way. Same with someone who has dyslexia or someone on the autism spectrum. And this person in this TED Talk does a really good job at describing their own lived experience. What is it like to be them? You probably saw a few things in their descriptions that match up with your own experience. So hopefully that helps you see that people who are neurodivergent are still obviously people. They have different skills, talents, abilities, and their brain is processing information in slightly different ways. They can learn behavioral skills and techniques to try and seem more neurotypical, which is kind of like the term for normal. So a neurotypical person wouldn't have, say, these disabilities, so these neurodivergences, but really every human has a slightly different neurology, right? So that is the point of neurodiversity, is that accepting of these things not as disabilities, but as accepting that they exist, that the brain is working slightly differently, and then maximizing what it can do, supporting things that it's maybe struggling with to help people thrive. That's essentially the entire point of this neurodiversity movement. And maybe it's because I'm within this aspect of neurodiverse with ADHD, even now in adulthood, that I really do latch onto this idea. I think it's really useful. It's very helpful and a lot more inclusive than saying, hey, these people have disabilities, we need to fix them. Well, you don't necessarily need to fix them. Maybe there's a few skills they need to learn slightly differently, but there's also abilities that they might have that are different than other people, similar to other talents and skills and abilities that people have. So there's some other examples of people talking about the differences that they have and how they were actually a strength to them. So feel free to watch any of those. Again, I might include some of these in the discussion board for this chapter, but there's quite a few topics that I'm debating whether to include as the discussion board. So it might not be this one, but some great videos there. All right, so let's move on to some other cognitive changes in middle and late childhood. So going back to Piaget, this was the concrete operational stage. So that's between 7 and 11. Piaget thought reasoning was in place in relation to concrete things and operations. So looking at these cup examples, so pouring the water into a taller cup, at this point it would be understood that pouring the same amount of water into a tall cup versus a wide cup, you would understand that that is still the same amount of water. So you're developing the ability to understand the reversal of actions as well. You can take back that water pour into another cup. You can classify things into different groups. And you might be listening to that list and say, wait, I know a child who's 5 that does a lot of these things. And that is the case. Piaget did a good job making some of these observations early on, but we do see now that a lot of these processes happen at different times as well as in different orders, and generally a lot earlier than Piaget had assumed from his observations. But that was our starting point, and we've moved on in the research since that point. So how do we process information? Let's talk about working memory. We've mentioned this a couple times in talking about memory, but working memory is really the term for what we used to call short-term memory. So the working memory is essentially your mental workbench. I think the movie Inside Out is actually a really good example of this. In your conscious mind, essentially, you have yourself working with information. You can imagine it being the big table in front of those characters in Inside Out. So like the emotions, and working memory isn't really driven by the emotions, but I think the image works well. So you bring up a memory from the past, something that's happening now, your interpretation of body language of someone. You're working with these things together to say, oh, this person likes me, or something like that. Oh, or this person's really upset with me about something. So you're working with that. It's your mental workbench. You've put it on your table. You're working with past memories, current things that are happening, senses that are coming in right now, and you're then deciding what to do with it. So you're manipulating that information, making decisions, you're actively using and even modifying information. So you might get a sensory input that's really, really loud, and you might assume that that's because someone is mad, but then you look at them and you see their facial expression, and maybe actually they're scared. And so then you modify the information that you're working with there in your working memory before you, say, store it in long-term memory or take some action. So there's a really great description of working memory. I was going to speed it up for this video, but since this whole lecture will be on YouTube, you can speed it up as we watch it together yourself. You can also click this link and watch it yourself. But I will just play it at normal speed and then comment at a couple different places. But it's a really great description of working memory. Hopefully you have a lot better understanding at the end of it.
So yesterday, I was out on the street in front of this building, and I was walking down the sidewalk, and I had company, several of us, and we were all abiding by the rules of walking down sidewalks. Okay, we're not talking to each other, we're facing forward, we're moving. When the person in front of me slows down, so I'm watching him, and he slows down, and finally he stops. Well, that wasn't fast enough for me. So I put on my turn signal, and I walked around him. And as I walked, I looked to see what he was doing, and he was doing this. He was texting. And he couldn't text and walk at the same time. Now, we could approach this from a working memory perspective or from a multitasking perspective. We're going to do working memory today. Now, working memory is that part of our consciousness that we are aware of at any given time of day. You're doing it right now. It's not something we can turn off. If you turn it off, that's called a coma. Okay? So right now, you're doing just fine. Now, working memory has 4 basic components. It allows us to store some immediate experiences and a little bit of knowledge. It allows us to reach back into our long-term memory and pull some of that in as we need it. Mixes it, processes it, in light of whatever our current goal is. Now, the current goal isn't something like I want to be president or the best surfer in the world. It's more mundane. I'd like that cookie. Or I need to figure out how to get into my hotel room. Now, working memory capacity is our ability to leverage that. Our ability to take what we know and what we can hang on to and leverage it in ways that allow us to satisfy our current goal. Now, working memory capacity has a fairly long history, and it's associated with a lot of positive effects. People with high working memory capacity tend to be good storytellers. They tend to solve and do well on standardized tests, however important that is. Okay? They're able to have high levels of writing ability. They're also able to reason at high levels. So what we're going to do here is play a little bit with some of that. So I'm going to ask you to perform a couple tasks, and we're going to take your working memory out for a ride. You up for that? Okay. I'm going to give you 5 words.
So I do encourage you, as you're watching this video, to try these things. Try this activity right now, see how you do, and then mark down how you do afterwards, maybe in your notes.
And I just want you to hang on to them. Don't write them down, just hang on to them. 5 words. While you're hanging on to them, I'm going to ask you to answer 3 questions. I want to see what happens with those words. So here's the words. Tree, highway, mirror, Saturn, and electrode. So far, so good? Okay. What I want you to do is I want you to tell me what the answer is to 23 times 8. Just shout it out. In fact, it's exactly. All right. I want you to take out your left hand, and I want you to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's a neurological test, just in case you're wondering. All right. Now what I want you to do is to recite the last 5 letters of the English alphabet backwards. You should have started with Z. All right. How many people here are still pretty sure you've got all 5 words? Okay. Typically we end up with about less than half, right? Which is normal. There'll be a range. Some people can hang on to 5, some can hang on to 10, some will be down to 2 or 3. What we know is this is really important to the way we function. Right? And it's going to be really important here at TED because you're going to be exposed to so many different ideas. Now, the problem that we have is that life comes at us, and it comes at us very quickly. And what we need to do is to take that amorphous flow of experience and somehow extract meaning from it with a working memory that's about the size of a pea. Now, don't get me wrong, working memory is awesome. Okay? Working memory allows us to investigate our current experience.
So at this point right now, I meant to pause it a little bit ago. Do you think you have all 5 of those words in order? So maybe right now write those words down in the order that you remember them. I'll say what I think they were. I mean, I might have a little advantage here because I watched this video basically every single semester. So we've got tree, highway, mirror, Saturn, and electrode. And I believe that was the correct order. Go back and watch the video to make sure. And one thing I did, and we'll talk about this with memory, is to encode that information to make it more meaningful. I actually used a mnemonic. So what I did is I imagined a tree. For me, it was a deciduous tree. It was green, like the fluffy green top, kind of like you would see a child draw who's in middle childhood, how they might draw a tree. Connections. So that tree was next to a highway, and then I'm driving down the highway, and I look in my mirror. So there we've got tree, highway, mirror, and then in that mirror, I can see Saturn. So pretty cool image in my brain. So seeing Saturn there, and then also just superimposed over the top of Saturn in my image was an electrode. So that is how I remembered those, and that'll be relevant to memory as we talk about how to use working memory, how to keep, how to use different techniques to improve working memory, and just how it works in general.
As we move forward, that allows us to make sense of the world around us. Right? But it does have certain limits. Now, working memory is great for allowing us to communicate. We can have a conversation, and I can build a narrative around that, so I know where we've been and where we're going and how to contribute to this conversation. Allows us to problem solve, critical think. We can be in the middle of a meeting, listen to somebody's presentation, evaluate it, decide whether or not we like it, ask follow-up questions. All of that occurs within working memory. It also allows us to go to the store and allows us to get milk and eggs and cheese when what we're really looking for is Red Bull and bacon. Right? Got to make sure we're getting what we're looking for. Now, a central issue with working memory is that it's limited. It's limited in capacity, limited in duration, limited in focus. We tend to remember about 4 things. Okay, it used to be 7, but with functional MRIs, apparently it's 4. We were overachieving. All right. Now
So What that joke basically is referring to is previous studies of working memory showed that people could remember about 7 chunks or pieces of information at a time, whether that's 7 individual numbers or units or 7 individual words, 7 different ideas. Originally, studies of working memory showed humans could remember about 7 things at one time and work with them, and then if they did not put them in long-term memory, then they would forget them, or they could put them in long-term memory. More recently, we've realized no, it's actually closer to around 4. Neurologically, that's about how many chunks of information we can work with at any given time. So that was what that joke was referring to. More recent research has seen that working memory is more about 4 chunks at a time.
We can remember those 4 things for about 10 to 20 seconds unless we do something with it, unless we process it, unless we apply it to something, unless we talk to somebody about it. When we think about working memory, we have to realize that this limited capacity has lots of different impacts on us. Have you ever walked from one room to another and then forgotten why you're there? You do know the solution to that, right? You go back to that original room. Okay? Right? Have you ever forgotten your key?
So it is a funny joke, but it is actually a relevant finding, is that when you go into that previous room, you are now remaking connections that your working memory was working with a moment ago for the information that you were thinking of. So that neuron pathway, or the neural pathways that were being activated a minute ago when you were in that, remembering that thing or thinking about that thing, part of that might be reactivated and literally well, it's not actually a spark, but essentially sparking that idea again. So pretty interesting how our memory works that way.
Ever been involved in a conversation and you realize that the conversation to your left is actually... Right? Have you ever forgotten your keys? You ever forgotten your car? You ever forgotten your kids? Okay. Ever been involved in a conversation and you realize that the conversation to your left is actually more interesting? Right? So you're nodding and you're smiling, but you're really paying attention to this one over here until you hear that last word go up and you realize you've been asked a question. And you're really hoping the answer is no, because that's what you're about to say. Okay? All of that talks about working memory, what we can do and what we can't do. We need to realize that working memory has a limited capacity, and that working memory capacity itself is how we negotiate that. We negotiate that through strategies. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about a couple of strategies here. And these will be really important because you are now in a information target-rich environment for the next several days. Right? Now the first part of this is that we need to think about and we need to process our existence, our life, immediately and repeatedly. We need to process what's going on the moment it happens. Not 10 minutes later, not a week later, at the moment. So we need to think about, well, do I agree with him? Right? What's missing? What would I like to know? Do I agree with the assumptions? How can I apply this in my life? It's a way of processing what's going on so that we can use it later. Now we also need to repeat it. We need to practice. So we need to think about it here. In between, we want to talk to people about it. You've got to write it down. When you get home, pull out those notes and think about them and end up practicing over time. Practice for some reason became a very negative thing. It's very positive. The next thing is we need to think elaboratively and we need to think illustratively. Oftentimes we think that we have to relate new knowledge to prior knowledge. What we want to do is spin that around. We want to take all of our existence and wrap it around that new knowledge and make all of these connections and it becomes more meaningful. We also want to use imagery. We are built for images. We need to take advantage of that. Think about things in images. Write things down that way. If you read a book, pull things up. I just got through reading The Great Gatsby, and I have a perfect idea of what he looks like in my head. So, my own version. The last one is organization and support. We are meaning-making machines. It's what we do. We try to make meaning out of everything that happens to us. Organization helps. So we need to structure what we're doing in ways that make sense. If we are providing knowledge and experience, we need to structure that. And the last one is support. We all start as novices. Everything we do is an approximation of sophistication. We should expect it to change over time. We have to support that. The support may come in asking people questions, giving them a sheet of paper that has an organizational chart on it or has some guiding images, but we need to support it. Now, the final piece of this, the take-home message from a working memory capacity standpoint is this. What we process, we learn. If we're not processing life, we're not living it. Live life. Thank you.
Definitely one of my favorite TED Talks and really relevant for how we do things throughout life. Because like you said, the working memory is that mental workbench, that place where we are essentially existing and doing things day by day, minute by minute, taking in the information from me, from the video, applying it to the things that you read in the class or in the textbook, those kinds of things. This other video on how we process memories goes into more detail, very similar to your book, like elaboration, rehearsal, talks about those kinds of skills. So a good thing to watch if maybe you wanted a review on those, but we're not going to watch it right now. So with that, so remember we're talking about middle and late childhood. Working memory in this time is developing pretty slowly. So at age 8, we can only hold between about 2 to 3 chunks of info. And then like we mentioned, adults can hold about 4 or 5 chunks of info. So good working memory, we see people with good working memories having good language ability, math skills, they're able to solve problems quicker or easier, good reasoning ability. And that makes sense because you're using that information well to solve problems and things like that. So some strategies to improve that working memory or to improve your memory in general are elaboration. And a lot of these terms that I'm using right now, he described them in that video, just without using the term elaboration. So think of examples of things, build on that info. If you're learning new things in an instrument, but you've learned another instrument in the past, you might elaborate and think of examples and connect them that way. Mental imagery, so the way I remembered those 5 words, let's see if I can remember them still. So we've got tree, highway, mirror, Saturn, electrode. You'll have to go back, see if I'm correct. I think I am. But I used mental imagery to do that. I visualized something. I visualized that tree, that highway, the mirror, the planet, and an electrode. So mental imagery does work better for older children than younger, mostly because they have more experience with seeing things, different objects, understanding the context, how things work together, concrete operations of things. So based on that experience, older children are better at this. But it still is helpful even younger. So remember when visualize or visualize relevant information, you might remember a note that you've taken because you remember where you wrote it down on your notebook. So if you're ever using open notes on an exam, I found that to be the case. I'm like, oh, I remember reading that topic. It was on the top left of a page. Where is that page? And then I'd find the information, be able to answer the question. So mental imagery is very helpful. Work to understand material, not just memorize it. So you might memorize all the important words, all the important terms, but if you don't make it meaningful or personalize it or elaborate on it, understand what's actually working together, all those definitions and memorizations won't matter as much. It won't stick in your memory as long. And you won't be understanding that full big picture. Like you mentioned in the video, take all your previous knowledge and wrap it around that new knowledge. So experts are people who have extensive knowledge about a single content area. So they know how to attend to important information. They know how to organize it, represent it, and interpret it. So if you have an expert in anything, whether they're an expert in playing music, in doing research on purpose in life and heroism, if you have an expert in political science, if you have an expert in mechanical engineering, they have this knowledge about that specific content area, how to pay attention to what's important or not, and how to interpret new information. These skills and abilities make it a lot easier to solve any relevant problems. So if you have a mechanical engineering problem and you're an expert there, you'll do a lot better job about solving that problem. You can reason about that topic in a lot more detail, and you can add more new content to their memory, to your own memory, because you already have so much to then wrap around that new information. So experts can learn that new information quicker than, say, a novice could. So older children are more likely to be experts in any given area, and this makes sense because to get that extensive knowledge, you need to work with something and practice for a long time. So while middle children can start to become experts in specific areas, maybe you've met a middle child that's an expert on dinosaurs and the time periods of the ancient earth or something like that. Older children are more likely, because they've had more time, to do this process, to become experts. So creative thinking is also changing at this time, and that's creative thinking is defined as our ability to think in novel and unusual ways. So coming up with unique solutions to problems. So we often think of it as like painting or playing music is creative. But when I have a problem on how to do a study, how to get this data that I need and ask people the right questions, coming up with an outside the box solution to that, that's also creativity. And so you might see creativity in other realms, in your own occupations or hobbies. And so often creativity appears in some domains and not others. So you might be really creative in research methods, for an example for me, but you might not be very creative in, say, drawing. So again, this is me we're talking about here. Or you might be creative in your math and how you solve math problems, but not in writing. You might be really creative in two-dimensional art, but not three-dimensional art. Things like that. Intelligence is another thing that the book talks about at this time. Intelligence is the ability to solve problems, adapt, and learn from experience. So this video here summarizes a lot of the points the book makes. So it's a good one for review, but we're not actually going to watch it as a class right now, but definitely a good one to go over. So there are so Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence thought that we had analytical intelligence, the ability to analyze, judge, evaluate, compare, and contrast new information. Creative intelligence, and that would be to create, design, or imagine things. And practical intelligence, which is what we do to use or apply knowledge or information. Gardner had a different idea about intelligence and basically expanded on that to have 8 types of intelligence, or 8 frames of mind. Verbal intelligence, mathematical, spatial, bodily or kinesthetic, so like knowing how to move your body or where it is in space, musical, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalist. So with that, these are the kind of current views of intelligence. You've read about IQ in your book, which is just a single score that's trying to represent all of these. Gardner's and Sternberg's tried to break that down into more evaluable chunks at smaller levels. So, heredity. What do your genetics have to do with intelligence? Well, not very much, it seems. There's really low correlations with different genetics, so an R of 0.15 is a very weak positive correlation. Environment seems to have a really big impact. So if you're in low SES, you probably are at a higher risk for a lower IQ. IQ is rising in general around the world, so that's an interesting thing. Intellectually stimulating environments in early childhood, so more books, more speaking with children, that kind of thing, are related to higher IQ. Group differences do exist, so we'll talk about why this is, so just hang on for a second. So black students in the US score 10 to 15 points lower than non-Latino white students. So why is that? Well, Latino students also do score lower, and the gap narrows in college. So when measuring younger children, we see these gaps, but everybody's about the same when they're getting to college age. Why is that? Well, a lot of the reason for this, that it seems to be, is because of stereotype threat. So you probably know what stereotype is, so a general idea about some group. Usually it's kind of a positive or negative idea about that group, a stereotype. So a stereotype threat is a person's own belief that their behavior might conform to a negative stereotype. And so because of that, they actually do perform more poorly based on their fear about confirming that stereotype. As an example, I had a friend who was, let's use a different example. I saw a video one time of a person talking about stunt driving. They were trying to learn to drive a car and do a stunt in a short film that they were creating. So based on their ethnicity, they knew there was a stereotype against their ethnicity in the realm of driving, that they might be a poor driver. So they really felt that they really had to do very, very well at this task to really show that they could drive well. And because of that, they were a lot more nervous. They didn't hear all the directions that they were given. And in the end, they didn't do as well as they could have if they had calmed down and forgotten about that stereotype. So that is what stereotype threat does. So with that, another risk factor here is that black students in the US do tend to be lower income, which we talked about earlier, does put you at higher risk for lower IQ scores. Another big thing here is that IQ tests were originally designed and tested only on white middle class and upper class students. So that's kind of a very, not kind of, that is an incredibly specific group to design a test based upon. So I'm trying to design different surveys to measure prosocial behavior and even heroism. And what I do to get a good sense of will this measure what I want to is I try to get as much diversity as I can in the people that I measure. So when you are only testing white people in a certain specific socioeconomic class, then that's what your scores are going to be based on. So the test is flawed to begin with. So that is the primary reason we saw those IQ differences. And another good reason to break it down into multiple types of intelligence, to look at problem solving in different specific realms. So newer tests of IQ are better, but the field in general is very resistant to using new measures when they've used that for so long. So it is problematic. It's a thing that the field is working with right now. So there are differences in intelligence. Is it because of these specific differences? No, almost certainly not. Things like stereotype threat, things like SES and the experiences that you have over time, the things that you're able to be exposed to, those are going to have a lot bigger impact on your intelligence. And again, breaking it up and looking at verbal intelligence versus mathematical, you can imagine how a young person in middle or late childhood who has a lot of experience with, say, verbal opportunities, maybe they get to read a lot, they get to speak to people a lot, they might do a better job at that than someone who doesn't have those opportunities. Same with mathematical. If you aren't exposed to a lot of different ways to do math, you're not going to internalize or become an expert in those things. So when we're thinking about these cognitive changes in middle and late childhood, I really want us to think about that developmental cascades. So that there are specific things that are protective factors that can lead us to positive outcomes, and there are things that are risk factors that can lead a young person to more negative outcomes. So we want people to be able to have these kinds of intelligences, right? We want them to be able to do well in what they choose to. So protecting them in a way that gives them the protective factors to succeed in the future is a lot of what developmental science is about, and what I want to encourage you to do as you look at maybe the children in your own life in middle and late childhood. How can you support them, support their skills? This goes back to also the neurodiversity topic that we've covered. So how can you support their specific abilities, reinforce and help them and support them in things that they might be lacking in because of either lacking in experiences or because of neurodiversity, things like that. So help young people and help people in general in a way that can support the things that they have and improve upon the world in general. So hopefully that's what you're taking from this discussion here on cognitive changes. Next time we will come and talk about middle and late childhood again and focus on socio-emotional development in Chapter 8.